Hello, eighth grade. In preparing to teach you guys about the Civil War, I was doing some research on General Jackson's family tree, and I traced it all the way back to the Civil War, the Jackson family. I traced their family lineage all the way back to the Civil War, but then I hit a stone wall. I'm actually not going to tell any more Civil War jokes because I generally don't like them. Okay, that's it. We got 2 more slides to do on this chapter, and then we are done. So let's do it. The last section of the chapter is all about the outbreak of the Civil War. So we already have the secession of South Carolina with the election of Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1860. Remember, this is the final event that accelerates the nation towards civil war. Right? After Lincoln is elected president, a lot of Southerners think, well, that's it. War is inevitable. If you had asked Southerners in 1850 if they thought that there was going to be a civil war, a lot of them probably would have said, hopefully not. Right? In 1860, after the election, if you asked Southerners if they thought there was going to be a civil war, they would have said definitely. Right? So attitudes shifted a lot between 1850 and 1860, and the election of 1860 was the final nail in the coffin. From this point on, it was, war was on the horizon. Everybody knew it. So South Carolina secedes. 6 other states follow South Carolina's lead. The Confederate States of America is formed. They create a constitution. It gets ratified. They elect Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln, meanwhile, isn't even president yet. Right? All of this stuff starts to happen before Lincoln even becomes president. Oh, another thing that happens is the South starts to take control of federal property in the southern states. So they take over like post offices, which are operated by the federal government, not the state governments. They take over a lot of land that belongs to the federal government. So they're basically saying we're not going to pay any attention to what the United States federal government thinks. We are our own country now, right? So Lincoln has all of this going on in his head before he's even president. So he decides to use his inaugural address as like a last-ditch attempt to save the country from civil war, right? So in his speech, Lincoln makes some promises. He promises the Confederacy that he is not going to interfere with slavery in the slave states. He says, look, I know that you're not happy I'm elected. I don't want civil war, though. And I promise I am not going to do anything to get rid of slavery in the slave states. Number 2, he promises the Confederacy that the United States is not going to attack them. Right? But he does say, unless you come back to the Union, war is going to be inevitable. So he says, I'm not going to attack you. I'm not going to order federal troops to attack you. But you need to come back, otherwise there will be a war. And then the third thing he said is, and by the way, you guys are not a different country. The Confederacy is not a separate country from the United States. The Confederacy is a group of rebel states. Right? So he says, please come back. Right? The Confederacy obviously is not happy to hear this, so they reject Lincoln's speech. They reject the promises he made. They refuse his offer to return to the Union. They're ready for war. So how does the Civil War actually begin? Well, it begins with the seizure of federal property in the South, and most notably, the most important seizure of federal property in the South happens at a place called Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter is a little tiny fort on an island. Here's a picture of it today. It's a little tiny pentagon-shaped fort on an island, jutting off the East Coast in the South. And it's a military fort, and it's occupied by 100 United States Army troops. So there's only 100 soldiers in this fort. And the South looks at this fort and they say, we're going to take it. So Southern military forces surround the fort, and they start to bombard it. They don't all out attack it, but they're definitely putting a lot of pressure. They're not letting anyone leave the fort. They're not letting anyone into the fort, and they're having this big standoff, and they're waiting for the soldiers inside to surrender. Well, the U.S. commander of the fort refuses to surrender. And because he refuses to surrender, in April of 1861, so just a couple months now after Lincoln has been inaugurated president, the Confederacy attacks Fort Sumter with military force. They fire cannons at it and stuff. And they set parts of it on fire. And this marks the beginning of the Civil War. Right? This attack on Fort Sumter is the first official battle of the Civil War. Now, it's important to realize nobody wanted the Civil War to happen in the beginning. I'm talking like back in 1850, right? If you asked Southerners if they wanted Civil War, they would say no. If you asked Northerners if they wanted Civil War, they would say no. But Abraham Lincoln later has a pretty good quote, and he says that war came with the attack on Fort Sumter because the South would rather make war than return to the Union, and the North would rather accept war than let the Union die. Right? So the South attacks first, and that's what Abraham Lincoln is harping on. Right? He's saying, I kept my promise. I didn't attack you. You attacked us. Right? I invited you back. You didn't want to come back. Right? War was inevitable because of you, not me. Right? And Lincoln was probably right. All right. That is it for this chapter.